You think being a thief meant quick riches and daring escapes under moonlight? Think again. In medieval times, stealing wasn't a game. It was a brutal gamble where even a single loaf of bread could cost you your hands, your freedom, or your life. Before you romanticize hooded rogues and forest bandits, let's peel back the fantasy and reveal the filth, fear, and fatal consequences. Because in the world of kings and castles, being a thief wasn't thrilling, it sucked. The mud squelched beneath his feet as he darted through the narrow alley, heart pounding like a war drum. Every breath of damp, putrid air seared his lungs. His name was Elric, a boy no older than 16, and tonight he had made a mistake. He had stolen from a butcher's stall in broad daylight. A slab of salted pork, worth a meal, worth his life. The shouts of the town guard echoed behind him as iron boots crashed through muck and filth, growing louder. The walls of the alley closed in like jaws. He turned the corner, only to face a dead end. In the medieval world, poverty wasn't just common, it was destiny. Born poor, you die poor. But desperation bred thieves, and towns were crawling with the hungry and the bold. Yet justice in medieval Europe was anything but blind. It was raw, public, and often terrifyingly creative. Punishments weren't just retribution, they were theatre. A lesson to others, a warning carved into flesh, displayed on gallows and burned into public memory. For Elric, and countless others like him, the price of survival could be the pain of a lifetime. That day, Elric was caught. No lawyer, no court date, no second chance. The bailiff dragged him by the collar to the village green where the stocks were already stained with dried blood and urine. A small crowd gathered. Children curious, elders grim, merchants smug with victory. His hands were bound, his face shoved forward. The sentence? Public flogging and a mark of shame, his ear to be notched, a permanent reminder of his crime. The whip cracked, the crowd roared, and Elric screamed, not just in pain, but in humiliation. And the worst part? He was one of the lucky ones. In other towns, punishments were far more inventive. Thieves had their hands chopped off on blood-soaked blocks. Some were hanged from trees or gallows for stealing, as little as a silver coin. Others were thrown into dungeons so filthy, rats were the only company. And for repeat offenders, there was branding. Hot irons pressed to skin to mark a man forever as a criminal. A thief could never truly hide. The law would follow him like a shadow, whispered from town to town. Trust? Gone. Work? Impossible. Redemption? A fairy tale. But not all thieves were caught. Some became legends. Outlaws who hid in the woods, ambushing wealthy travelers, living off stolen bread and whispered fame. Yet even those stories end in blood. One such man, Willem the Red, ruled a stretch of forest outside York with a band of rogues. For 3 years he evaded every trap. His name echoed like a curse among merchants. Until one of his own betrayed him for a handful of silver. He was dragged through the streets, beaten to a pulp, and hanged from a tree he once called home. His corpse rotted there for weeks. A warning, not a memorial. And the people? They watched. Children stared, some cheered, others wept, but none looked away, because that was the purpose. Medieval justice didn't hide behind walls. It marched into the square and made a spectacle of sin. The message was clear: steal, and your pain will entertain the town. Theft didn't always look like a hooded figure slinking through the dark. Sometimes it was hunger. Sometimes it was rebellion. Other times it was just opportunity. A forgotten pouch at a tavern table, a baker who turned his back for too long. The poor, the desperate, the bold. They didn't always see it as crime. They saw it as survival. But the law saw no nuance. It didn't matter if your family was starving. If you stole, you were a criminal. And for many, it was a death sentence, written in silence. Medieval towns operated with a harsh rhythm. Every village had its stocks, its scaffold, its whipping post. Markets bustled with life by day and silence by night, save for the few daring enough to creep through their shadows. Walls and gates were built not just to keep invaders out, but to keep thieves from slipping away. Town guards were paid poorly, but loved the power. Many were ex-criminals themselves, eager to prove loyalty through brutality. There were no fingerprints, no forensics, just accusations and witnesses, often biased or bribed. A thief could be accused without evidence. Sometimes your enemies needed only a rumor to destroy your life. Trial by ordeal, one of the most barbaric justice systems, was common. Accused of theft, you might have to hold a red-hot iron bar. If your burns healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they festered, you were guilty. The gods, it was believed, would protect the righteous. The rest? Condemned by blisters and superstition. In England, under the reign of King Henry III, theft could result in being hanged, even for minor offences. Children as young as 7 could be tried as criminals. Imagine that, 7 years old, dangling from a rope, watched by the same village that once cradled you. In France, pickpockets caught in the act were often mutilated publicly. In Germany, thieves might be caged and suspended over the town square, exposed to the elements for days. And in parts of Eastern Europe, a particularly cruel punishment involved sewing the thief into a sack with wild animals, then throwing it into a river. Women were not spared. Female thieves, especially those caught stealing from the wealthy, were subject to unique punishments: public shaving of the head, parading through town in chains. In some areas they were flogged naked, their bodies marked not just by the whip, but by the stares of those they once called neighbours. The shame lasted long after the pain ended. But here's the cruelest twist. Many who turned to thievery had no other option. A failed harvest, a sick child, an unpaid debt, these could push even the most honest soul into crime. And the systems designed to help, almost non-existent. Charity was rare and often laced with humiliation. Monasteries might feed the poor, but not without sermons, labor, or exploitation. The rich hoarded their wealth, guilds protected their own. Everyone else was expendable. Still, not every thief was desperate. Some were professionals, trained cutpurses, skilled lockpickers, traveling con artists who moved from town to town. They learned how to blend in, how to read people, how to strike and vanish. But even they lived with the constant fear of betrayal. One wrong move, one slip, one vengeful lover, and they'd be in chains before dawn. Then there were the smugglers, thieves of the sea. Men and women who stole salt, wool, or spices, avoiding harsh taxes by moving goods in secret. Punishment for smuggling could be as severe as for common theft. Boats burned, property seized, crew imprisoned or executed. But smuggling kept towns alive. Entire villages survived on the underground trade, even as the law hunted them like dogs. In many parts of Europe, gallows didn't just serve justice, they dominated the skyline. These towering structures were placed deliberately at city gates or high on hills, visible from miles away. Newcomers would see the rotting corpses of executed thieves swaying in the wind before they ever set foot inside the walls. The smell, the sight, the silence, it was all part of the system. A deterrent written in blood and bone. Some towns went further. In Italy, thieves were occasionally tied to poles with their crimes written on wooden plaques hung around their necks. Passers-by were encouraged to spit on them, to hurl dung or stones, to remind them that society not only rejected them, it relished their suffering. In the Low Countries, repeat offenders might be branded on the forehead with the letter T for thief, a mark that followed them for life, long after the pain faded. But what about those who got away? Not all medieval thieves were caught. Some became legends. Ballads and tales spread of highwaymen with hearts of gold, of daring escapes and noble motives. But reality rarely matched the myth. Most who escaped the noose lived in exile, moving from town to town, never staying long enough to be recognized. They hid in woods, slept in barns, begged, stole again. The life of a thief wasn't one of wealth and fame. It was one of fear, cold, and constant motion. The woods and wilds of medieval Europe were not kind. Wolves hunted the same paths as men. Bandits ruled without mercy. Diseases festered in wounds. The only allies thieves found were others like them, outlaws, deserters, and the truly desperate. But even among thieves, there was little trust. The fear of betrayal was stronger than friendship. At any moment, a companion might trade you for their own freedom. Urban thieves in cities like London, Paris, or Prague faced different dangers. These growing centers had night watchmen, city guards, and sometimes even rudimentary prisons. They also had organized crime. Gangs formed, controlled districts, extorted shopkeepers. The skilled cut-pursers were valuable, but only if they paid tribute. Step out of line, and punishment came swiftly, not from the law, but from your own kind. Some thieves tried to repent. They confessed, sought mercy from the church, or attempted to return stolen goods. Occasionally they were granted leniency, but mercy was rare and forgiveness was fragile. One false move and the past came crashing down. Redemption in the Middle Ages was not for those without power or name. It was for the privileged few. For the rest, one wrong step led straight back to the scaffold. And yet, the people still stole. They stole bread, wool, candles, wine, chickens, horses, gold. Sometimes for need, sometimes for spite, sometimes just to feel something other than powerlessness. Because for all its cruelty, medieval Europe was not fair. Lords dined on silver while peasants ate rats. Taxes crushed the poor while nobles waged wars for glory. Theft, in its rawest form, was rebellion, a middle finger to the order of things, and though it rarely ended well, it was, for a moment, a reclaiming of control. Theft could also be political. During times of famine or war, when kings raised taxes or clergy hoarded grain, mobs of peasants would turn to organized looting. Sometimes whole villages rose in protest, storming manors, pillaging churches, breaking open granaries. The church called it sin. The crown called it treason. But to those who starved, it was justice, rebellion disguised as robbery. These uprisings were almost always crushed, swiftly, mercilessly. Ringleaders were dragged to the square, tied to wheels, and broken bone by bone. The message was clear: steal from the system, and the system will break you. But even within monasteries and cathedrals, theft was not unknown. Monks caught stealing relics or treasures from abbeys were defrocked, imprisoned, or worse. In one infamous case, a novice monk stole a jeweled crucifix and tried to flee to another city. He was caught halfway across the moors and sentenced to be boiled alive. Yes, boiled, slowly, in public. It wasn't about recovery, it was about fear. Theft among nobles existed too, but it was called something else. Appropriation, tribute, feudal rights. A lord who stole land from a widow might frame it as protection. A knight who took livestock from peasants during war might claim it as necessity. The law bent for the powerful. It crushed the powerless. So while a hungry child might lose a hand for stealing apples, a baron could steal a village and call it inheritance. Inside castles and manors, even servants weren't safe. Accusations of theft ran rampant. A missing spoon, the kitchen girl would be whipped. A dropped ring, the stable boy vanished overnight. Many nobles used theft as a pretext to punish or remove servants they disliked. Some made examples of them, nailing their ears to doors or forcing them to walk barefoot on broken glass through the main hall. A reminder to the rest, obedience over suspicion. Guilds, though offering protection for tradesmen, also enforced brutal rules around theft. A blacksmith caught stealing tools or secrets could be exiled from town. A merchant who manipulated weights could be banned from markets or branded. In some cities, a tailor who sold stolen cloth had his fingers broken with hammers, one joint at a time. Even the sea wasn't safe. Maritime theft, piracy, was punishable by death, of course, but also by drowning, crucifixion, or forced conscription. Pirates were rarely romantic figures in this era. Most were desperate men, ex-sailors or war veterans with nothing left. Life on a stolen ship meant constant hunger, mutiny, disease, and betrayal. And when caught, pirates weren't given trials. They were dragged to shore, chained to docks, and executed on sight, sometimes hanged from the very mast of their ship. But the greatest punishment a thief could face wasn't pain. It was erasure. To be cast out, declared outlaw, no legal protections, no one allowed to feed, shelter, or assist them. An outlaw could be killed by anyone, anywhere, without consequence. They became ghosts, living in forests, caves, abandoned ruins, hunted by lawmen, ignored by villagers, feared by even their own kind. A thief with a blade wound might lie in a ditch for days, watching carrion birds circle, too ashamed to cry for help. Being a thief meant constant calculation. Every step was a risk, every meal uncertain. Even in the shadows of a bustling market, you had to read people like scrolls, watching for the flick of an eye, the twitch of a hand, the angle of a coin purse. The best thieves never rushed. They floated through crowds like ghosts, unnoticed until the damage was done. But skill didn't guarantee safety. There were moments when luck simply ran out. Take the case of Marta, a famed cut-purse in Bruges. She could lift a coin pouch without the wearer even noticing its absence for hours. For 5 years she eluded every patrol, fed her siblings, and built a quiet life. But one day she picked the wrong nobleman, one with a sharp memory and a sharper dagger. She wasn't arrested. She was dragged into an alley, throat slit, and body left in the canal. No trial, no punishment, just silence. Reputation could be both shield and target. If you were known as a thief, you were watched, hated, sometimes feared. But fear didn't buy bread, and even fear wore off. The people you once outsmarted would eventually come for you, and they often came with chains, clubs, or fire. Villagers believed that thieves brought curses, and some were even lynched by mobs during famines or plagues, blamed for misfortune they never caused. Some medieval towns developed their own informal codes. Neighborhoods would protect a local thief if he shared his earnings, especially if he targeted outsiders or tax collectors. But even that support was fleeting. As soon as a thief became inconvenient or was caught with something too valuable, the crowd would turn. Loyalty died quickly in lean times. Punishments were not just for the body, many were psychological, designed to humiliate and dehumanize. Some thieves were forced to wear iron collars with bells, announcing their shame with every step. Others had their noses slit or ears removed. These weren't just injuries, they were lifelong scars that made it impossible to re-enter society. A man with no nose would find no bride, no work, no refuge. He was ruined. And children? Oh, the children. Pickpocketing rings often relied on them. Small hands, innocent faces. Easier to hide, easier to discard. Street gangs used orphans and runaways as tools. If they were caught, the punishment was the same. A 10-year-old could be whipped to the bone, branded, or even hanged. There were no juvenile laws, no mercy for youth. In the eyes of the law, a thief was a thief, no matter how small. Even churchyards weren't safe. People stole from graves, from pilgrims, from the donation boxes meant for the poor, and when caught, the punishment was doubled, both by the law and the church. A thief who desecrated sacred ground might be excommunicated, their soul damned, their body denied burial. Some were stoned to death in the cemetery itself, their blood mixing with the sacred soil as a warning. But perhaps the most damning fate was this: no legacy. Most thieves disappeared into the dirt. No headstone, no name, no memory. They were erased, their crimes forgotten, but their suffering never told. Until now. And yet, Despite it all, thievery never disappeared. The need never went away. As long as there was inequality, there were those who would steal to survive, and those who would steal because they could. But make no mistake, the medieval thief was not a hero in a storybook. They were not Robin Hood with a twinkle in their eye and a noble cause in their heart. Most were cold, desperate, hardened by cruelty, and hunted by a world that offered no second chances. In cities like Florence, Paris, or London, night brought fear, lanterns flickered, shadows deepened, and if your coin purse jangled too loudly, you risked never making it home. Wealthy travelers hired guards, merchants carried daggers, some slept with money sewn into their clothes. Locks grew more elaborate, doors thicker, walls taller. But even the best defenses couldn't stop the truly determined. Some thieves used chimney flues, others burrowed through walls. A few even posed as priests or nuns to gain access to sacred buildings and steal relics. The church sometimes tried to intervene with mercy. Monks might offer thieves sanctuary, offer them work in fields or kitchens. But if the law demanded punishment, even the church had to hand them over. Sanctuary was not protection. It was postponement, and some bishops had no qualms about watching a thief whipped at the cathedral gates, declaring it a lesson from God. Punishments evolved as cities grew. Pillories were made more elaborate. Some included mechanisms that allowed townsfolk to rotate the criminal in place, exposing them to jeers from all sides. In harsher towns, thieves were buried up to their necks in the square and left for a full day, exposed to sun, insects, humiliation, and waste. Children threw rocks. Dogs sniffed and urinated. There was no dignity left to strip away. There were even laws forbidding kindness to thieves. A woman who gave water to a bound criminal could be punished herself. A farmer who let a fugitive sleep in his barn might lose his livestock. Mercy in the medieval world was a luxury few could afford and fewer dared offer. And so the thief walked alone, always moving, never safe, never trusted. A ghost in life, a warning in death. But not all tales ended in blood. A few escaped, disappeared into forests, changed names, sailed to distant shores. One old legend tells of a French thief who faked his death, joined a monastery, and became a respected scribe. He wrote psalms by day and laughed alone by candlelight, because he knew what the others did not. He had survived a world built to destroy him. He had walked through fire and come out the other side with ink-stained fingers and a soul he refused to let rot. But survival was rare. Most thieves didn't become legends or monks. They became bones in shallow graves outside city walls, unmarked and unmourned. The townspeople who cheered their execution would forget their names by the following market day. Life moved on. The market stalls opened again. Children played in the same square where a man once screamed as the rope tightened around his neck. In medieval Europe, death was ordinary, public, repetitive. Yet the threat of thievery always returned. Towns tried to innovate. Some passed laws requiring all strangers to register upon arrival. Others hired thief-takers, paid informants who hunted criminals for bounties. These men were ruthless. They didn't care about justice, they cared about coin. Many were criminals themselves, flipping sides for the highest bidder. And if they couldn't catch a real thief, they sometimes framed one. After all, a public hanging still counted as payment. Some rulers grew obsessed with eradicating theft. King Edward I ordered all vagrants and wandering men in England to carry proof of work, or be imprisoned. King Louis IX of France authorized whipping posts in every town square, and priests were instructed to preach obedience and the consequences of sin. Steal, they said, and you'll suffer not only on earth but in the fires of the afterlife. Fear became doctrine. Punishment became religion. Despite all of this, some people romanticized thieves. The poor admired them for challenging the system. Ballads were written, tales told at taverns. Some truly believed that a clever thief was more honorable than a greedy lord. These stories gave hope to the hopeless. If a thief could win just once, maybe so could they. But these stories were just that, stories. The truth was far darker. Take the story of Anselm, a smith's apprentice who turned to theft after his master beat him near to death. He stole food, then tools, then coin. He lasted a year before he was caught in a churchyard trying to rob a noble's tomb. They broke his legs with iron bars before dragging him to the square. He was burned alive on a pyre of stolen wood. No legend was born, only ash. Or Isabella, a widow who lost her land when her husband died without a male heir. She had nothing, so she took bread from a monastery kitchen once. She was caught by a monk, tied to a post, and lashed until her skin split like old cloth. She survived, barely, branded on her thigh. She lived 5 more years, always limping, always hungry, and always watched. For every thief who became a tale, 100 became forgotten. And then there were the prisons. If you were lucky enough to be thrown in one instead of hanged, medieval prisons weren't for rehabilitation. They were holding pens, torture chambers, and death sentences in slow motion. Imagine stone walls slick with moss, no toilets, rats gnawing your toes as you sleep, no beds, no food unless someone on the outside brought it to you, chains rusted into your ankles, daylight a memory. And all because you stole a bolt of cloth or a crust of bread. Some jails were run by lords who extorted prisoners' families for their release. Others were controlled by corrupt guards who took what little prisoners had left. Disease ran rampant. Typhus, dysentery, fever. A thief could survive the noose only to die coughing in the dark, buried in lime with no prayers said. Some were simply forgotten, left in cells for years until they died alone, nameless and skeletal. But maybe the cruelest aspect of all was the hypocrisy. The same nobles who condemned theft often committed it on a grander scale. A lord who taxed a village into famine faced no punishment. A bishop who hoarded tithes while his parish starved was called wise. Yet a man who stole grain to feed his children, he was dragged through the streets like vermin. Still, thievery persisted, like weeds in the cracks of a crumbling empire. Wherever there was injustice, there were those who dared to push back, even if they paid the price. They weren't saints. Many were selfish, some were violent, but all of them were products of their world. A world that gave them nothing and punished them for trying to take anything. Even the word thief carried more weight back then. It wasn't just a label, it was a sentence. It followed you like a curse. If you were branded or maimed, there was no hiding it. You might as well have worn a sign that read, "Unworthy." You were shunned in markets, denied sacraments, forbidden from marrying, and if you tried to start over in another town, the gossip followed. Medieval communities were small, tight, suspicious. One whispered accusation could get you killed all over again. So the question becomes, why steal? Why risk everything? The answer was simple. Because doing nothing meant death too. Because when you're starving, when you've been cast out, when the laws are built only to protect those above you, the moral line becomes blurry. Survival becomes a rebellion. Every loaf taken, every coin snatched, every chicken gone missing was a cry against a system that saw you as expendable. But even in the darkest corners of medieval justice, there were strange exceptions. Cracks in the iron wall. In some towns, thieves could pay for a trial by combat. If they defeated their accuser in a duel, they were declared innocent, even if they were guilty. It wasn't about truth. It was about who could fight better or afford a champion. In rare cases, bribed judges or officials and walked free. This only deepened resentment, proving once again that in medieval society, justice was for sale. Certain festivals, like the Feasts of Fools or Midsummer, were strange havens for criminals. During these wild celebrations, social order was temporarily flipped. Beggars could mock lords, mischief was tolerated, even encouraged. Some thieves timed their crimes for these days. knowing crowds and chaos gave them cover, and sometimes, if they were clever, they got away with it, disguised as jesters, dancers, or drunken priests. But those moments were rare. Most thieves didn't die in cleverness, they died in agony. Consider the wheel, a device of pure horror. A thief would be tied to it, arms and legs splayed, then bludgeoned with a club until their bones shattered. They were then woven through the spokes and left to die in the sun. Or the iron cage, suspended in the town square, where they slowly wasted away. Food for flies and of course, the gallows tree, simple, silent, yet even these deaths weren't always the end. In some towns, thieves weren't buried in churchyards. Their corpses were dumped in pits or burned in mass graves, denied the afterlife. Families who dared to mourn were fined or worse, punished themselves. The shame stretched beyond the grave. And what of the people who watched these punishments? Were they heartless? No. They were conditioned. Medieval society thrived on public fear. Children grew up watching executions the way we watch television. Spectacle was normal. Blood was educational. A thief's agony was a lesson taught weekly in the town square. But deep down, many knew the truth, that they were only one bad season, one bad lord, one bad turn of fate away from that scaffold themselves. And so they watched. And they feared. And they hoped they would never be forced to make the same choice. Because being a thief in medieval times wasn't just about crime. It was about desperation, about power, about surviving a system built to keep you hungry, silent, and terrified. The gallows weren't the end. They were the symbol of a world that ate its own. And as medieval Europe lurched toward the later centuries, the laws only grew more elaborate, more precise, but no less cruel. Legal codes expanded to categorize theft by value. Steal something worth more than 12 pence? Death. Less than 12, flogging, branding, mutilation. These laws were etched into stone, into scrolls, into the minds of terrified villagers. Knowledge of punishment spread faster than tales of mercy, but there were places, on the fringes of civilization, where alternative systems developed. Some remote communities handled theft with restitution instead of punishment. If you stole, you were made to pay back double or work for your victim. This wasn't mercy, it was practicality. In a village of 50 people, every hand mattered. Killing a thief could mean losing a blacksmith or a shepherd. But such systems were rare, fragile, and often quashed by regional lords who saw leniency as weakness. And sometimes justice wasn't legal at all. It was personal. Families wronged by theft took revenge into their own hands. Blood feuds erupted between neighbors, lasting years. A man who stole a sheep might be murdered in his sleep. His family in turn might torch the barns of their accuser. The church preached peace, but few listened when hunger turned to hate. Even within cities, night patrols evolved, not to protect thieves, but to catch them before they became too skilled. These watchmen carried horns, clubs, and lanterns. Anyone caught out after curfew without permission was suspect, and anyone found with stolen goods was treated like the devil's agent. Watchmen were judge, jury, and sometimes executioner, and they were often corrupt. There were thieves who became informants. Desperate to save their own skins, they betrayed their friends, mapped hideouts, revealed caches of stolen goods. Some were rewarded, given food, shelter, even pardon. But few escaped the mark of betrayal, and none ever escaped the guilt. Among the most feared were the highway thieves, those who robbed on open roads. These weren't pickpockets or desperate peasants. These were armed bands who ambushed caravans, slaughtered merchants, and disappeared into the woods. Kings placed bounties on their heads. Villagers burned their hideouts. Some were so feared their names lived on in whispers long after they were caught and hanged from roadside trees. One such man was known only as the Black Rider. He wore a hood made from the scalp of a nobleman he once robbed. He struck at dusk, always alone, always silent. He was never caught, only killed by an arrow to the back, fired by his own brother for the promise of gold. His body was hung for 30 days. Birds tore his face away. The townspeople swore the tree never grew leaves again. But most thieves weren't riders or warriors. They were beggars, mothers, old men, people who'd been broken by the system, people with nothing left to lose. And when winter came, thievery soared. It was the season of frostbitten hands, empty barns and silent fields. The cold bit harder than any guard's blade, and those with nothing often faced a choice: freeze or steal. Inns were full, gates were shut, and charity was scarce. Travelers caught in snowdrifts might be found days later, robbed not just by strangers but by neighbors. Sometimes the dead were stripped not for greed but survival. The justice system didn't soften in the cold. In fact, public punishments were sometimes more brutal in winter. The frozen air made wounds sting longer, made lashes crack louder. People slipped on blood that froze to the square stones. Still, crowds gathered. Children laughed. The punishment of thieves was part of the rhythm of life. Executioners were given small stipends and treated like a necessary evil. Few spoke to them. Fewer still wanted their job. But they knew how to kill with precision. A thief could be dispatched quickly or slowly, depending on the town's mood, or the status of the person they stole from. Some were beheaded with a single stroke. Others were hung and left to choke for minutes. Some were disemboweled, their guts burned before their eyes. These were not just deaths. They were performances, tales of miracle thieves spread in hushed tones. Like the woman who, according to local law, stole bread for her starving son and wept so bitterly at her own execution that the sky turned black and the church bell rang by itself. The crowd fell silent. The judge fainted. A statue was later built in her memory, but these were rare and likely fiction. For every myth, there were 1,000 unremembered. Some thieves tried to escape punishment by fleeing to outlaw territories. Bands of exiles and rebels in the mountains, forests, or islands. These enclaves had their own rules, their own leaders, their own dangers. They offered no peace, only a different kind of chaos. Still, to a condemned man, chaos was better than chains. And the deeper you go into the records, the more you realize thievery was never truly about right or wrong. It was about power. Who had it? Who didn't? Who could take without consequence? Who couldn't even beg without being beaten? Thieves lived at the sharp end of society's blade. They were condemned not because they sinned, but because they broke the illusion of order. When a thief succeeded, it showed how fragile the system was. That frightened those in charge. That's why the punishments were so cruel, so theatrical. It wasn't about deterrence, it was about dominance. About reminding the masses that mercy was a myth and justice had a price. And still, they stole. They stole even when they knew the price. Even when they'd seen friends hanged or lovers branded. Even when the village crier shouted another name, another punishment, another lost soul. Why? Because need doesn't care about fear. Hunger drowns out dread. A crying baby, an empty bowl, a landlord's boot on your neck. These things pushed people beyond fear and into desperation. And once someone stole, they were marked for life. Recidivism wasn't just likely, it was guaranteed. Not because they chose crime, but because society never let them stop being criminals. A branded man couldn't find honest work. A woman who'd been in the stocks couldn't marry. A child whipped in the square wouldn't be trusted with anything again. So they kept stealing. Not because they were evil, but because the system left them no other choice. The church preached forgiveness, but the townsfolk rarely practiced it. Once you were a thief, even if you repented, suspicion clung to you like mud. People crossed themselves when you passed, whispered in markets, closed their doors. Even your own family might disown you to protect their reputation, and for those who managed to flee their village and reach another town, hope was slim. Documents were rare, but gossip was not. A man with missing fingers or a slashed ear would be noticed. Questions would be asked. Some towns had lists of known criminals, some just relied on the watchful eyes of gossips and tavern keepers. A wrong glance, a familiar face, and it would all begin again. Yet even so, in every generation, thieves emerged, in part because of human nature, but more so because of a system that punished the poor for being poor, punished the hungry for eating, punished the powerless for daring to act. Theft wasn't the disease, it was a symptom of inequality, of cruelty, of desperation worn thin by winter and war. By the late Middle Ages, Europe began to change. Cities grew, laws codified. Some punishments softened. Branding replaced mutilation in some regions. Prisons became more common. There was a shift, however small, toward correction instead of obliteration. But for most thieves, this was too little, too late. They had lived their lives under the gallows. They had walked streets where blood soaked the stones. They had dreamed only of another meal, another warm night, another day without chains. We remember so few of them. We tell stories of kings and knights and saints, but not of the boy who stole a pear and lost his hand, not the mother who snuck into a merchant's cellar for wine to trade for medicine, not the girl who pickpocketed soldiers because they'd stolen everything from her family first. These people, the forgotten thieves, were woven into the foundation of medieval society. They were punished, erased, and silenced. Until now, their voices have remained locked in the margins of history, mentioned in court scrolls, etched into execution ledgers, or scribbled in the panic-laced diaries of townspeople. And yet, even those records rarely gave them names. They were just a thief, a pickpocket, a beggar who stole flour. But they were people, living, breathing, thinking, hoping people. Some prayed before their punishment, some cursed, some wept, and some simply stood still, empty of fear or resistance, already dead in every way but the final breath. Their stories are not just footnotes to kings and crusaders. They are windows into the cruelty and contradiction of medieval justice, a time when the theft of a sheep could earn you the same fate as a murderer, when a clever hand could both feed a family and doom a soul, when stealing a cloak to survive the night could get you strung up by dawn. And yet, the systems that punished these people were never truly about morality. They were about power. Theft threatened power. Every stolen loaf, every lifted pouch was a reminder that control could be breached, that the hierarchy was fragile, and so the punishment had to be overwhelming. Not just physical but symbolic. The gallows, the brands, the cages, they were not just for the thief. They were for everyone watching, and the people did watch. Crowds gathered not just for justice, but for spectacle, for distraction from their own hunger, for the comfort of knowing that today, at least, it wasn't them. That thin line of luck or birth or silence that separated them from the man in chains, that illusion of safety, was reinforced with every scream and every cheer. And it worked. For a time, but not forever. By the twilight of the Middle Ages, things began to shift. The rise of towns, the early whisperings of human rights, and the printing press started to stir new ideas. Some thinkers began to question the cruelty of the system. Not many, not loudly, but enough to plant seeds. The thief, once seen only as a criminal, began to appear in plays, songs, and even pamphlets as something more complex, not a monster, but a man. Still, for most of the medieval era, being a thief meant being hunted, hated, broken. You were disposable. Your pain was public property. Your story ended in silence, but now we remember that behind every branding iron was a shaking hand. Behind every public hanging, a life that could have gone differently. We remember that thievery was not simply a matter of choice. It was often a consequence of being born into a world that offered no choices at all. And we begin to see the thief not just as a symbol of crime, but as a symptom of a deeply flawed society. Their actions were desperate whispers in a world that shouted obedience and silence. They weren't villains, they were warnings. Reminders that when justice becomes cruelty and law becomes fear, rebellion will come in the smallest forms. A stolen loaf, a missing coin, a pair of eyes watching from the alley. Their lives were hard, their endings were often brutal. But their existence demands to be acknowledged, not glamorized, not erased, but understood. Because if we don't understand the past, we repeat its worst patterns. We build systems that punish instead of protect. We ignore the desperate until they take what they need, and then we condemn them for it. So the next time you walk past a dusty museum display of shackles or read a line in a history book about medieval justice, remember the human behind the crime. Remember that the gallows didn't just kill a thief, they killed hope, possibility, and resistance. And maybe, just maybe, that's why their stories were buried for so long. Because they dared to resist. Because they forced a system built on order to tremble, if only for a moment. This is their legacy, not one of glory or triumph, but of survival, pain, and the fragile flame of rebellion that even death couldn't fully extinguish. So ask yourself, if you lived in their world, starved under their sky, suffered under their laws, what would you have done? Would you have followed every rule? Or would you have stolen bread just once and risked everything? The answer isn't easy. It never was. But it's a question worth asking, because buried beneath every noose and nail is a truth most kingdoms feared to admit. When survival is a crime, even the smallest act of defiance becomes a revolution. And that is why it truly sucked to be a medieval thief.